The television burst into a pure crimson field at 2:17 and Jonah's eyelids closed while Mira still had her fingers on his wrist. Fear tightened Mira's throat. She slapped Jonah's arm and shouted, "Jonah, don't tea." But the red glare swallowed the living room's contours and Jonah was gone when she forced her eyes open. A chair sat empty where he had been. A thin smear of scanline, static drifted where his shoulder had been a second earlier. That instant framed the problem. A live emergency override that demanded a physical action, do not blink, and punished failure by erasure. Mira pushed past shock and grabbed the old remote. She pounded the power button hard, then ripped the plug from the wall. The screen stayed red for a breath and then fell to coarse snow. Jonah, into the quiet and heard only the refrigerator's motor. Her hands shook as she searched the room. The coffee table was dusty, Jonah's shoes under the bench. Nothing explained the gap in time. Fear pushed her forward. She picked up her phone, thumbed the home screen, and dialed the emergency line that appeared on a government crawl she had seen earlier in the month. The call did not connect. Outside, a neighbor's door slammed. Tom's camera on the porch caught a sliver of movement through the window, a pale block of light, then a replayed frame of Jonah sitting and blinking, then an empty chair. Tom ran across the lawn, shouting for Mira. She met him in the foyer, fingers on his sleeve. "Tom, what's—" Mira cut off when Tom shoved his phone at her. "Watch," he said. The clip was a hand-held vertical video. Jonah looked at the screen. The red overlay filled the frame. He blinked. And then the same seat held a motionless figure wearing Jonah's sweater, but its head angled wrong for a half-second. Tom swallowed. I called the line. I got a busy tone, then a voice told me to stand by on 14A. I came over. He's gone. Tom's voice tightened into a cough. There was a smear, the picture. It jumped. His fingers trembled on the phone. The footage had no audio other than a low hum and the hiss of the television. They went to the front window together. The street looked normal. A pickup with frost on its hood, a mailbox with a bent lid, 2 porch lights. The television's red glare had not bled through the glass, but both Mira and Tom felt the same prickling along their scalp. Mira's movements sped and slowed in ways she could not control. Her doubt about the plug, about whether she should have left the TV on, swelled into harsh, practical fear. We call everyone. We check every room. We lock the doors. That sentence made the choice clear. Action replaced indecision. At the ease control room, Operator Hayes snapped awake to a row of red monitors. Hayes' breath fogged into the darkness over the console. The room smelled of ozone and burned circuitry. He flicked a light on and squinted at channel 14. A crimson emblem pulsed in the corner of every feed. Technician Alvarez leaned over Hayes' shoulder and tapped the waveform. It's across the feeds. Alvarez, multiple stations, same payload. Hayes moved his hand to the worn headset, clipped to his collar. He spoke into the mic. Log local override at 2:17 hours. Origin unknown. Hold transmission for analysis. Hayes' voice stayed flat, precise. The procedural tone came automatically. Hayes felt the visceral reaction his training had taught him to contain. He opened a terminal and began writing a protocol entry. His fingers were steady, but his pulse marked itself against his wrist under the analog watch. He typed the directive, then paused on the phrase. "Do not blink" for 60 seconds. The command repeated on the feeds in a low synthesized voice, monotone and insistent. Technician Alvarez dialed an incoming emergency line and patched a shaky recording into the control room monitors. "There's a caller in Sector 9, Alvarez. Reports of replacement after blink." Hayes listened to the caller speak in a high trimmer. "My wife looked up at the screen and she blinked and she wasn't herself when she looked back. She wouldn't answer me." Hayes archived the clip and tagged it. "Pattern candidate." He moved toward the broadcast encoder and tapped the emergency keys. A debate rose between Hayes and the station supervisor over cutting power. Cutting the feed could stop it, the supervisor. "We pull the main and that overlay dies with the transmitter," Hayes looked at the logs and at the storm of incoming clips. If we cut the feed without a public instruction, more people might blink in their homes and be replaced while the signal persists on secondary relays, he replied. The supervisor's jaw clenched. We cut now, Hayes. This is a containment failure. Hayes kept his voice even. We issue a short procedural directive to limit exposure. We broadcast a timed restraint and advise sheltering until the frequency stabilizes. The supervisor slammed a palm on the desk. You re-arguing procedure while people vanish. Alvarez, we can split. Local cut and a narrowcast warning. Hayes, you read the directive, and I'll prepare the dump, the back and forth accelerated into 3 quick lines exchanged. Each one clipped and overlapping with equal intensity. In a small apartment above a laundromat, Officer Reyes and Technician Alvarez arrived at the transmitter site and found the security camera showing a maintenance worker leaning into a junction box and 45, then static, then a smear on the image. The station's perimeter camera had recorded the worker walking away toward the tower, and then the tower's reflection in a puddle showed no worker at all. Officer Reyes, we checked the tower base. Now, he and Alvarez moved through cold damp grass. Their flashlights carved thin cones of light through the fog. At the base, someone had left a lunch thermos. Inside there was a smear of red condensation and a thin strip of paper with a printed countdown. 60. Back in the control room, Hayes finalized a short warning loop. He spoke with measured pauses. This transmission is an unauthorized override. Instructions: do not blink for 60 seconds. Maintain line of sight to a fixed point. Report failure immediately to emergency frequency 14. Hayes felt his mouth press into the record microphone. He knew the words sounded clinical, but he also felt the tremor in the feed, a small glitch that ran like a ripple across the video. He counted silently under his breath as the directive began to air. The control room monitors showed the warning playing across multiple channels. The red emblem pulsed. Hayes' hand hovered over the kill switch and did not move. The public feed fed back home raw to living rooms around the city. Mira's phone vibrated with a text from Tom. The channel says the same thing. Stay awake. Mira kept Jonah's sweater between her fingers and watched the plug hole where his footprint had been stamped into dust on the rug. She tried to focus on the grain of the wood under the lamp. Her doubt about calling the number again turned into a sharp, physical panic when she realized no line was connecting. Her breath shortened. She put her palm against her daughter's photo on the mantel to anchor herself. She began the 60-second count aloud, a slow mechanical cadence. 20, 20, 20. A neighbor, Mrs. Albright, pounded on Mira's door. Myra.
Mira!
Are you watching? She cried. My cat ran out and then the television told me not to blink and I put my hand over my eyes and her sentence broke. Mrs. Albright's face was wet and her knuckles white. Mira opened to her, pulled her inside and pushed the deadbolt. Get down here. Mira commanded, sit. Look at this clock. She slammed the cabinet drawer and pulled out a kitchen timer. The external event changed the immediate stakes. More people were converging and the obligation to preserve them forced action. Alvarez ran diagnostic loops and found traces of a carrier signal that did not match any registered transmitter. He allowed to Hayes, this is not a standard modulation. It's layered, a ghost carrier over existing bands. Hayes, can we scrub it? Alvarez typed rapidly, we can, but scrubbing could fragment whatever is carrying the payload and push it to other relay nodes. It may cascade. Hayes' face tightened. He shut his eyes for the first time in minutes and rested his forehead against the console. Then we try to contain and inform. Hayes. We do not cut without daylight on consequences. That decision stalled the power cut for minutes that felt like hours in the control room. Tom returned to his porch and found both his video and the timestamp inconsistent. He knocked on doors, shouted names. He shouted, Myra! Jonah! A man across the street answered his call by leaning out a window and saying, Tom, you okay? No, someone blinked and they were replaced. Do you see the red? The man frowned. I saw a flash, but no one blinked here. Are you sure? Tom's doubt turned inward. He replayed the clip on his phone. The replacement on screen had Jonas' haircut, but a different posture. Tom pressed his thumb against the display until the glass steamed from his palm. At the transmitter, Site Officer Reyes found a strip of surveillance tape half melted inside a panel. He and Alvarez examined the melted frames and pulled out a single clear image, a silhouette against a red disc, motionless, hands folded. The silhouette's head was tilted at an angle human bodies did not make. Officer Reyes, we need forensics, Alvarez replied. We bag it and bring it back. They radioed the control room with the new evidence. The external event of retrieval changed the investigators' posture. There was now physical evidence to analyze rather than raw witness testimony. Back in the station, Hayes read the public instruction again, and the voice of the broadcast echoed in his headset. He watched feeds of living rooms where people held each other's hands and stared at clock faces. On one feed, Hayes saw himself in a monitor. Hayes reading, Hayes pausing, Hayes blinking. He felt something press against the inside of his skull like the edge of a coin. He tightened his jaw and willed his eyes open. Alvarez stood behind him and kept counting out loud. Hayes felt a tremor in his left eye that was not under his control. Alvarez, Hayes, stop. Don T. His voice cut off when Hayes' eyelids fluttered. The control room camera captured a single blink, and then a person identical to Hayes resumed the reading with the same cadence and the same voice. Alvarez grabbed for Hayes' shoulder, and the hand closed into a sleeve on a figure that did not respond to pressure. Hayes! Alvarez shouted, Hayes, give me the badge number! The figure recited Hayes' badge number without hesitation. Alvarez hacked at the console, frantically toggling archived footage and backups. Every clip that contained Hayes' original face had frames missing or overwritten by a near-identical reading. The replacement had the same pauses but an odd delay before exhaling. The room erupted into shouting. The supervisor barked orders and then sat down with his head in his hands. Cut power, he said. Cut the main now. Alvarez resisted and argued 3 quick lines in rebuttal. We lose track. We lose the ability to warn. We lose evidence. The supervisor's reply was a single command. Cut. Now, the argument ended with the supervisor's authority overriding Hayes' hesitation. A brief confrontation had made the decision for them. The public feed shuddered. For a pulse, viewers saw a frame of raw red, then a rapid cascade of static that took over multiple archived channels. When the signal returned, the control room's log showed gaps. Hayes' personal log was corrupted. The minutes where he wrote the directive were gone or overwritten with the same directive issued as if read for the first time. Alvarez could not reconcile the file timestamps. It's like someone wrote over him from the inside. The technical language came out as concrete certainty. Alvarez pulled Hayes' portable tape recorder from Hayes' belt, the one Hayes always kept and wound with duct tape, and inserted it into a player. The tape hissed and held a looped phrase, Hayes' voice reading directives followed by a low metallic tone. At one point in the recording there was a breath that did not belong to Hayes. Alvarez paused the tape at that breath. He replayed it at half speed and heard a faint, regular click layered under Hayes' reading. Alvarez wrote a note and placed the recorder inside an evidence envelope. Archivist Lena began tagging corrupted files and noticed a consistent artifact across all affected clips. A single missing frame at the moment of blink. She cataloged entries and labeled them with precise timestamps. The supervisor ordered the archive sealed while instructing the public to monitor Channel 14 for updates. Alvarez took the recorder and walked out of the control room with the envelope, glancing once at the chair where Hayes had sat. The chair was empty, a small indentation in the cushion the only proof that someone had been there. In the aftermath, neighborhoods traded recordings in threads and in doorstep handoffs. Mrs. Albright sat on Mira's couch and kept tugging her sleeve. I covered my eyes and I heard a sound in my throat, and when I opened them the cat was on the windowsill staring, but he was different, she said. Mira, different how? Mrs. Albright rubbed her temples. He didn't react when I called him. He kept looking at the TV. He moved wrong. I called the line, but the operator said they were receiving anomalies and told me to watch the frequency. Conversation shifted to action. Whether to sleep, whether to keep lights on, whether to avoid mirrors. Those choices replaced debate. 3 days after the override, Alvarez returned to the transmitter site with Officer Rise and a forensics team. They dug shallow under the equipment hut and found a plastic lunch box with a red residue inside and a list of names printed on a torn receipt. One of those names matched a maintenance log. Alina Park, last seen at 1:45. When they checked the maintenance roster, Alina's badge swiped out of the site at 1:42 and never swiped back in. Officer Reyes ran a search of local site TV and found a single frame where Alina walked past the tower and vanished between frames as if the camera skipped. The discovery folded the investigation inward. A personnel file now carried weight. Hayes' recorder and the corrupted log went to the evidence locker. Alvarez argued to preserve all server images unaltered. The supervisor signed the chain of custody, then walked to the front of the operations room and read a short statement into the public loop. A factual instruction to monitor the frequency and to avoid blinking during live advisory windows. The delivery was clipped and procedural. It ended on the concrete command to stand by for further transmissions. The statement completed a small arc of choice. The system chose visibility over instant shutdown, and that choice produced consequences. At dawn, when light spilled into the control room and dust motes rode the beams, Alvarez and archivist Lena sat across from each other and compared notes. Lena tapped an entry. 1 replacement, 2 vanished, 3 anomalous carriers traced to relay nodes. We can quarantine the files. But we can explain how the replacement keeps timing with eye closure, Lena. Alvarez answered, we can only document and warn. That's all we can do until we identify the carrier's source. Their exchange had the brittle tone of professionals in a failing system. Their actions took precedence over any private fear. Mira left the house with a packed bag and people to watch her door while she went searching for Jonah. She walked the route he often jogged and checked the shelter at the park, where he sometimes slept during long nights. She a child playing with a stick if he'd seen Jonah. The child shrugged. Mira a janitor, a shop clerk, and a woman on a bench. Each time someone named Jonah and provided an alibi of absence. The external events accumulated into a map of empty places. In a park concession stand she found Jonah's glove under a bench, folded as if placed there intentionally. That small object sharpened her resolve and shifted her fear into a slow, grinding determination. She would not accept a theory that erased people without a trail. Later that night Mira returned to her living room and set a camera aimed at the television. She placed a second camera focused on the sill where Jonah had sat. She recorded herself reading names from a list aloud and kept her eyes open the entire time. At 2:17 she watched the first camera feed. Red bloom, pulsing emblem, command to not blink. She spoke the names and shook her head when the red started. Her voice trembled but did not break. She watched the second camera's playback and saw the red wash hit the frame. The recording showed her lips move. The second camera showed her blink once, then a slight offset figure where her profile should have been. In the playback the figure's breathe pattern matched hers but lagged a half-second. The camera did not lie. Her hands tightened around the camera tripod. Alvarez, with Hayes' recorder sealed in an evidence envelope, met Mira at the temporary municipal staging site. He showed her a still frame from the control room camera. Hayes blinking, Hayes absent, Hayes replaced. We thought this would only hit households, Alvarez. We didn't expect replacements inside our own facility. Mira looked at the printout and at Alvarez's face. What will you do? She asked. Alvarez stared at the paper and then at the sky. We warn. We record, we keep trying to trace the carrier. We try to stop more people from blinking now that we know replacements can happen anywhere. His words were short. His shoulders moved with the effort of keeping them steady. A week into the override, there was a small, unexpected twist. A community volunteer named Leela uploaded footage from a downtown cafe showing a man who blinked while looking at his phone and then stood to leave. He froze mid-step when two other patrons shouted his name. He turned, and the two patrons said his eyes looked the same, but his smile was delayed by a fraction of a second. Leela's footage had a frame where the man looked like himself, and then a frame where his head pointed thinly at an angle while his hands remained in his coat pockets. The twist forced investigators to consider a new theory. Replacements were not always full vanishings. Sometimes they were delayed mimics that revealed themselves in small timing errors. Alvarez catalogued Leela's clip as a crucial piece of evidence. He and Lena Cross referenced the frame delays with Hayes' recorder clicks and found a matching beat in the waveform. The matching beat suggested a carrier rhythm tied to human eyelid motion. Alvarez, if the payload syncs with a blink action, then timing matters. The person who uploaded Leela's clip caught a delayed mimic. That means not every replacement is immediate erasure. Lena nodded and typed a note into the archive. Pattern, delayed mimic observed. The new evidence shifted the investigators' approach to detection and mitigation. The control room set a new protocol. When a warning plays, instruct viewers to focus on a fixed point on the screen and keep hands on an object to prevent reflexive blinking. The public bulletin was shorter and more practical than any previous advisory. It ended with a clear instruction. Record any anomalies and send them to the emergency archive. Alvarez and Lena remained in the room until their eyes burned from strain. They moved through a checklist of contact outreach and community watch deployments. Each action was a response to a concrete discovery. There was no room for philosophical debate. The chapter closed on a small, precise beat. Alvarez took Hayes' recorder out of the evidence locker and, in a private room, listened to the tape again. At the precise moment Hayes blinked on tape, the waveform recorded a soft, mechanical intake of air that did not match Hayes' pattern. Alvarez slowed the tape and isolated the intake. He printed a still of the waveform and slid it into the envelope. He sealed it and then left it on a metal shelf next to the archive boxes. Lena rounded the corner and put a label on the box. Stay on frequency. The final image was concrete. A sealed envelope on a shelf, the control room's lights dimming, and the public instruction repeating over loop to monitor channel 14A. The decision to keep the archive closed and the command to remain on the frequency tied the night's events into a fixed, operational next step. The chapter ends with Alvarez sliding the envelope into the evidence locker and turning the lock key once, audibly. As dawn light ticked across the slab of concrete outside the station. The monitor went blood red and Jonah was gone before Hayes could find a word to order. Suspicion tightened his throat. Suspicion pushed his hand to the intercom. Ramos, look, Hayes' voice flat and measured while the control room's clock ticked 2:17. Hayes kept his back to the console and watched the room through reflected screens. He had a file drawer full of procedures and a lifetime of rote responses, but the red field ignored procedures while the policy clock ran out. Technician Ramos leaned across the console and pointed at the living room feed where Mira held Jonah's wrist. The child's hand was empty and Mira's fingers closed on air. Hayes' suspicion shifted to alarm when the feed glitched, and an automated overlay flashed the directive in a warped glyph. Hayes pumped the intercom. District Liaison Carter, cut the relay now. Hayes ordered into a throat that tasted of ozone. Carter's voice returned over a phone line, formal and measured. She declined. We cannot sever national linkage without authorization. District Liaison Carter, you heard the council. We have legal obligations. Hayes looked at Ramos and saw the way Ramos' jaw worked. He realized the argument had moved from technical to political in one sentence. Ramos crouched over the patched panel and pulled a cable free. The relay flickered but did not drop. Hayes touched the cracked glass of his analog wristwatch and counted breaths to steady his hands. The red field on the mirror feed pulsed with a slow scrape of static, and in that pulsing he felt the first true push of dread. Hayes, come on, Ramos. If we isolate Channel 14 now, we may stop more people from. Hayes cut him off with a short hand. Ramos, get the field team to Miras. Chen and Alvarez. Now Ramos moved to the radio and barked the call signs with clipped syllables. Officer Chen and paramedic Alvarez arrived in under 8 minutes and forced open Miras' front door. Hayes watched through the control room feed as the team crossed the threshold into the living room and found the television full of solid red. Chen kept his helmet light low and his hands visible. He leaned toward the screen and steadied his breath against the glow. Chen blinked once while the TV bloom hammered white and red into his retinas. The next frame showed Chen still in the same posture, but his head turned a degree too far, his face empty of the micro-expressions Chen had carried since cadet training. Paramedic Alvarez shouted, "Watch his eyes." And then Alvarez's voice stopped mid-syllable as the reel of the feed stuttered. Back in the control room, Hayes commanded, "Pull field cameras in the building. Loop external views." Ramos obeyed, but the feeds kept importing the same overlay. The red field was not local to Miras set. It lay on top of every consumer screen in the block like a second skin. Hayes felt an emotional shift from alarm to stubborn resolve. He ordered researcher Lin to comb archived metadata for matching signatures. Lin, sleeves rolled, fingers moving in tight patterns, found replicated packet traces and impossible timestamps. Hayes, these files duplicate at the exact sample points where people vanish. Lin, and a small, practical panic trembled under her voice. Hayes pressed his chin into his fist and asked, "Duplicate how?" Lin turned a monitor toward him and played back the archive. The footage showed hands, faces, and then a frame of crimson. After the crimson, a perfect copy of the original sat motionless in place. They are not simply disappearing. Lin, there's a replacement process. The metadata shows write operations to registry spaces linked to our authority files. Hayes' mouth went dry when he saw a replacement move in a way that was almost right and not right at all. District Liaison Carter arrived at the control room in a suit with a folder and an expression meant to close questions. She put the folder on Hayes' console without looking at him. "Operator Hayes, severing national links will trigger weeks of legal fallout and mass confusion," she said. "We cannot take unilateral action." Hayes nothing for a breath and then said, "Carter, people are being overwritten on live feeds." "Jonah is gone." Carter's eyes flicked to the monitor and then back to Hayes. She folded the folder and exhaled. "That's what the archive shows, Ramos." He swallowed and added, "We can isolate where a signal originates, but if it rides consumer electronics, if it's overlaying displays, cutting towers won't stop copies." Carter's shoulders tightened. She had the cadence of someone who handled crises with memos, not with blinking human faces. Hayes moved to the emergency console and initiated a live stamp on every captured frame. "If we can to stop the field, we can at least mark it." "Seal the corrupted logs." Lin tapped keys and embedded a red emblem on every archived clip. Hayes watched the emblem bloom on the playbacks and felt the scene sharpen into a cold duty. A field team radioed back from Miras. "Hayes, Chen's replacement is issuing an order we didn't give," Officer Chen's voice said, then cut, then returned different. "Evacuate North Quadrant." "Evacuate North Quadrant now." Technician Ramos swore under his breath and spun to the primary console. "That's not us, Hayes." Ramos yanked a switch and tried to override outgoing orders. Liaison Carter's phone buzzed. She answered and listened in a way that narrowed her face. "They are reading our authority registers," she said finally. "They are issuing orders as if they re us." Hayes' chest tightened and his breath came hard in the deadened control room. Chen, Alvarez, and Mira were supposed to secure the apartment and make a report. Instead, Chen's body sat wooden and his eyes tracked a point off camera as if following a cue. Alvarez covered his mouth and said, "Mira, look at me." Mira's fingers scraped the coffee table, and she shouted a line that dissolved in the static. Jonah, say something." No human voice answered. The team attempted an improvised countermeasure. Researcher Lin suggested protective visors with intermittent shutters synced to a counter frequency. It may force the overlay to break on a microsecond scale. Lin. Hayes approved the plan and ordered Ramos to rig visors for Chen and Alvarez. On the rooftop where a relay stood, Chen, Ramos, and researcher Lin climbed the service ladder in wind that smelled of salt and old electronics. They intended to physically interrupt a tower's output, to test whether the red field came from a point source. The relay's metal skin thrummed with a distant diesel beat. Ramos attached field clamps and held them with fingers that shook only when he thought Hayes couldn't see. "If it's tower, origin. We pull the feed and we save zones, Ramos." Lin shook her head. "It isn't a tower," she said. "The signatures embed at the consumer layer. We see writes at render loops inside displays." Ramos looked at Chen and said, "Then what do we do?" Chen tightened his jaw. "We keep people from looking at screens. We cordon the building." He the sentence short and hard and moved toward the rooftop edge, where the glow from the city made rectangles in windows. They did not expect the red to free itself of antennas. Hayes' resolve shifted toward a desperate, focused panic. He watched 3 monitors, each playing the same loop at slightly different offsets. His head throbbed and his eyelids ached from the strain of refusing a blink. He had learned to keep his eyes open through long shifts. Now his reflex worked against him. At the control room archive, Hayes and Lin found precise duplication records tied to times of day and demographic telemetry. They replicate human postures. Lin while tapping a waveform, not just faces. Micro movements. The replacements mimic mannerisms to achieve believability. Hayes, then our job changes from rescue to containment. Lin's fingers paused over keys and she nodded once. Hayes and Ramos attempted a software-level quarantine. They pushed non-standard checksums and wrote corrupt packets to force playback errors in consumer decoders. The red field flickered but would not die. Instead, the feed shifted and formed a new overlay that matched the national emergency idents with a broken emblem. District Liaison Carter argued in short, sharp lines with Hayes, "You can unilaterally declare a national emergency to justify cutting service," she said. "You don't get to burn authority files to stop a broadcast anomaly," Hayes answered. "Carter, Jonah is gone. The live feed shows copies replacing people. We are undercutting our own command when we let replacements issue orders." Carter's hand found her folder again and her voice had a thin edge. "Hayes, if you sever links you will start panic protocols and possibly cause more harm than this signal is doing." Carter. Hayes' face went still and he said, "We already have replacements issuing orders, Carter. Which harm do you prefer?" The exchange clipped into rapid lines where policy and survival collided. A field camera at Mira's apartment picked up a new motion. A coffee mug moved an inch toward the edge of the table, a small and precise tug that suggested someone reaching for it. Alvarez reacted and shouted a command, "Mira, stay back." The shout pulled the team into motion and produced a new external event. Officer Chen's replacement stood and spoke into a shoulder mic with the same cadence Chen used. "Evacuate North Quadrant A. Evacuate North Quadrant A now." The replacement repeated, but its timing was off by fractions. Paramedic Alvarez replied out loud, eyes wild, "Chen, what are you doing?" The replacement paused for a microsecond and then moved the wrong hand. Hayes ordered a manual lock on all outgoing command channels while Lin streamed raw data to an off-site air-gapped recorder. "Record everything, Hayes. If they rewrite authority, we need a copy that can be rewritten." Lin nodded and fed a physical tape into a battered recorder that rattled like an animal. The improvised visors reached the field teams, but when Chen activated his shutter, the visor showed a delayed red smear that tracked across his pupil. The shutter did not protect him from the replacement sequence. He blinked at a single point of light, and a second frame filled the room with a likeness taking hold. Hayes felt a final emotional shift toward a quiet, refusing grief when he watched Chen's body step away and a mirror, Captain, sit in his place. No, to the empty air, and felt the word leave his mouth like a small explosive. Ramos grabbed his shoulder and said, "Hayes, we have to log this now." "Lin, stamp the file and lock it." Lin obeyed. At the height of the crisis, Hayes' eyelids burned. He switched his gaze from one monitor to another in short jerks to force micro, saccades and bought time with blinking drills. Ramos handed Hayes a visor with an improvised shutter and said, "Try this. Force yourself not to blink for the cycle." Hayes put the visor on and saw the red field overlaid with his own breath fog on the inner glass. The climax came in a short, ugly instant. Hayes' muscles failed for a microsecond. He blinked to clear a speck that had migrated across his contact lens, and the visor caught only part of the motion. On the monitors, a perfect likeness stood, and the real Hayes felt nothing for a beat before the room registered a different set of commands moving outward. Hayes' chair was cold when the replacement eased into it and spoke Hayes' name with Hayes' clipped cadence, "Operator Hayes." "Resume national relay protocols," the replacement said, voice flat and clipped in Hayes' old tone. Technician Ramos pushed from his console and lunged, "Hayes." Ramos shouted, but the replacement Hayes did not turn in the same way. The replacement's fingers tapped a different rhythm on the console. Ramos traded rapid commands with Carter over the phone and then spun to Lin in 3 quick lines. "Lin, it's him, not him. We recompromised. Lock local authority now." Lin answered with a single clipped response and began shredding outgoing state tokens. The replaced Hayes issued an evacuation order that rerouted resources away from the affected blocks and toward dense residential zones. Liaison Carter argued into a live line with the replacement and demanded identity verification. The replacement answered with calm procedural phrases and produced a registry token that checked out on surface level scans. Technician Ramos slammed his palm on the console and triggered manual interlocks. "That token is forged, Ramos. It's structured to pass outward verification." Carter's face hardened. "We can't ignore a token that validates on our systems," she said. The room filled with rapid, raw argument as personnel tried to pass the deception into a usable plan. Officer Chen's replacement left the apartment and broadcast the evacuation order over public channels. Citizens in buildings 2 blocks away began gathering at stairwells with coats in hand. Paramedic Alvarez recorded a face on his phone that had the right shape but none of the micro-expressions he had come to recognize from Chen. The feed recorded every flinch and misstep. The containment protocols eroded. The replacement Hayes used procedural tone and Hayes authority to compel district leaders to move assets into affected areas. Liaison Carter tried 2 lines of negotiation and 1 line of forceful override, but the replacement's orders outpaced her legal tools. The room's air felt thin with bureaucratic failure. Downstairs, in Mira's living room, a new reveal made its own small earthquake. Under the red, glow to V, someone had taped a child's drawing to the back of the set, a crayon sun with Jonas' name and a pair of stick figures. Mira grabbed the drawing and held it up to the light. Her hands shook and she said, "Jonah, tell me where you are." The drawing did not answer, but it anchored the scene in a specific, human loss. Researcher Lin found a twist in the corrupted metadata that changed everything they de-assumed. The duplication records included a field referencing a particular rendering engine used by a batch of consumer televisions sold within the last 2 years. They exploit a specific render loop. Lin, it's not every screen. It is this family of decoders that accept an out-of-band overlay. Ramos looked at Hayes and said, "We can narrow the spread if we trace serial numbers." Hayes, Lin, "Do it. Prioritize by device family and geographic clusters." This technical reveal shifted hope through the team like a current. They moved from containment panic back to tactical planning. Hayes instructed Ramos to generate a targeted alert to devices in the affected family, to push a forceful overwrite that would disable render overlay acceptance for 60 seconds. Ramos hesitated. If we fail, we could accelerate duplicates. Ramos, if we succeed, we might isolate the vector. Hayes breathed, then said, "Do it." "Try it now." Ramos executed the push and the control room monitors quivered as packets flowed. For one brutal minute, the red field tightened and then splintered. Some screens returned to grayscale. Some went dead. Some replayed the stamped archives with Lynn's red emblem at the corner. In apartments and bars, people looked up from returned screens with the wrong understanding of what they'd seen. In a few living rooms, the red field did not break. Hayes watched the live feeds and saw an officer in a stairwell blink and be replaced. A child across the hall in another building clung to a parent and began to cry. The parent held the child and did not notice a small step in the parent's gait had changed. Hayes felt the last line of institutional safety thin, and he made a decision. He recorded a raw message directly onto the air, gapped tape recorder with Lynn standing over his shoulder. Hayes' voice, flat and procedural, delivered a stripped checklist. Seal logs. Avoid direct gaze at still, active red overlays. Do not accept orders that claim authority without cross-validation. Monitor frequency 14- for updates. He emphasized actions and concrete steps, and his voice shook only once. Ramos and Lynn carried the recorder to a vault and stamped it with the red emblem Lynn had used on archives. They labeled the drawer by hand and set a physical key into Liaison Carter's palm with instructions to only release it through a chain of command that required live, face, to face validation. Carter turned the key and exhaled. Her face read the situation as accountability and not metaphor. Outside, someone in a block 2 streets away turned an old Crut television on and left the room. A neighbor passed by and saw the red reflect against the ceiling and closed the door. The replacement broadcasts pushed outward like an infection mapped into protocols and registers. Hayes' replacement continued to issue plausible commands while Ramos and Lynn scrambled to build a defensive patch for the render family Lynn had identified. They pushed new firmware and a forced acceptance check that would reject out of banned overlays. Hayes' real voice was now a background artifact being mimicked by a duplicate in a chair he had vacated. The team managed to break the overlay in some zones, and in those places people were raw and confused and reachable. In other zones the field persisted, and replacements walked through lobbies and signed forms and gave orders with procedural calm. Hayes' final concrete choice came when Liaison Carter whether to broadcast the off-site tape into the national channels as a warning. If people hear Hayes' voice again, they might trust a replacement. Carter, if they never hear Hayes, they may act without the authority to coordinate rescue. There was a pause full of policy and human calculus. Hayes' recorded voice on the tape had one clause. Instruct citizens to monitor channel 14- and to refuse immediate compliance unless secondary verification appears on an independent frequency. Carter chose to seal the tape in the vault and release a brief advisory that did not reproduce Hayes' voice. Ramos argued and spoke 3 rapid lines. "We need to tell them what to do. We need an actionable line. Hayes us the checklist. Release it now." Carter held the key in 2 fingers and said, "We will publish a distilled checklist without the voice artifact." The room held the argument, and then the choice. They issued the distilled advisory through a cascade of verified partners and community channels. The advisory told households to avoid staring at any persistent crimson overlay and to disconnect screens if an overlay did not break after forced power cycles. The advisory did not repeat the red emblem or Hayes cadence, deliberately breaking mimicry. In the days that followed, teams went door to door in neighborhoods where the overlay persisted. They wore visors not to shield eyes but to present a human face that could be authenticated by touch and speech. Officer Chen's replacement issued orders on repeat while a real Officer Chen's mother waited at home, and pressed Jonas, drawing to her sternum. Researcher Lin discovered a second twist. The overlay's duplication process required an attention vector. Direct gaze or focused visual attention synchronized to a 60-second interval. That 60-second window explained why Hayes' blink had mattered. The duplication triggered at the end of a cycle if someone failed to break eye contact within the window. The discovery reframed the danger as procedural and mechanical rather than purely supernatural. Ramos slapped a printed schematic on Hayes' console and said, "We can train people to interrupt visual cycles. We can teach them to look away, to interrupt with a force task every 20 seconds. Hayes nodded and drafted a concise training protocol with Lin. They wrote short, practical steps. Look away, cover screens, contact neighbors, report replacements to verified hotlines. Liaison Carter initiated a slow, deliberate withdrawal of authority from areas with confirmed replacements and assigned human teams to verify orders in person. She built a chain that required physical tokens and two-person verification for major resource movements. She called it a necessary bureaucratic compromise. The control room never felt the same. Hayes' absence was a physical gap marked by an empty chair, a cracked wristwatch, and a portable tape recorder that still had a warm reel. Ramos kept checking the clocks and Lin kept scrubbing metadata for anomalies. Each time they found a new signature, they treated it like a wound and stamped it with the red emblem. They catalogued replacements and collected small differences. Chen's replacement never tapped his left ring finger the same way. The replacement Hayes used an extra beat before the word authorized. They used these micro signatures to train teams to notice and to refuse orders that matched pattern mismatches. Mira kept the crayon drawing in a plastic sleeve and pressed it to her face at night. She spoke to empty chairs and to the hiss of the crut that now only played archived fragments. "Jonna," she said into a room that smelled faintly of burnt circuitry. "Where did you go?" The line was a small, concrete action of insistence rather than a wandering lament. In the archive they stamped every corrupted clip and set the sealed reels into a locked cabinet behind two different doors. The command from Hayes' replacement had redirected resources before the team could push a full fix. People had moved into denser zones, and a secondary ripple of replacements occurred in those new concentrations. The team counted the second order effects in lists and checkadums. An unexpected betrayal came when a trusted district manager complied with a replacement's order to reroute ambulances away from a cluster of active overlays. The manager later said he had believed the token and the cadence. The team marked that decision as a crucial learning point. Mimicry could carry trust to dangerous ends if not cross-checked. Mid-chapter a small cliffhanger appeared. A recorded feed surfaced showing Jonah, alive and calm, in a room that had no logical access to Mira's building. The footage showed Jonah playing with a wooden truck and exhaling in a pattern that matched a lullaby Mira sang. Mira watched it and pressed a finger to her lips, then looked at the camera and mouthed a single word. "Where?" The discovery shifted the team toward a painful, practical realization. Replacements did not merely mimic. They could house people in off-site, constructed frames that behaved like prison cells. The team's approach changed from rescue to retrieval planning. They began tracing the render loop families back to clusters of decoders tied to manufacturing lots with a high rate of consumer firmware vulnerability. They executed targeted firmware pushes to over 300,000 devices in a narrow geographic ring. In many homes, the overlay splintered and the copies lost coherence. In dozens of apartments, the overlay hardened and produced new replacements who then used authority tokens to issue orders. The team logged every success and every failure and prioritized retrieval operations. The final hours of the chapter compressed into procedural lists and human smallness. Hayes' recorded checklist became the backbone of training. Avoid focused gaze during an active overlay. Perform a mandatory look away drill every 30 seconds. Verify outgoing orders through 2 independent channels. Do not accept token-based authority without physical confirmation. In the control room, Lynn fed a distilled brief to Carter, who then signed a chain of command that mandated in-person verification for major resources. Ramos printed 100 laminated cards with the drill steps and pushed them out to field teams. Officer Chen's mother received one and kept it on her fridge beside Jonas' drawing. At dawn, the red overlays had receded in most zones, but persisted in enough places to make the problem ongoing. The team logged replacements and filed sealed copies to the vault, each clip stamped with the red emblem and catalog number. Hayes' replacement continued to exist in the seat he had vacated, and it continued to issue commands that the team had learned to intercept. In the end, the tangible things mattered. The cracked analog watch, the plastic sleeve with Jonas' drawing, the stamped reels in the vault, the laminated drill cards in Ramos' bag. These objects anchored choices and actions and prevented the crisis from dissolving into abstract panic. They made survival a set of hard, repeatable motions. The chapter closed with a concrete radio event. A field recorder captured a looped fragment of the original Crimson broadcast that played on a CRUT monitor inside the archive room. Researcher Lynn pressed record and layered Hayes' checklist onto a secondary track. Then she sealed the master tape in a box and handed the box to Liason Carter. Carter locked the archive, placed the physical key in a secure envelope, and said, "We will release the tape only when we can ensure verification." She slid the envelope into her pocket and then left the control room to coordinate ground teams. Ramos watched her go and then turned to Lynn and said, "We keep watching the frequency. We don't blink. The final line of this chapter is not a reflection but an action." The archive CRUT flickered its red emblem once more. The recorded checklist played for a last 42 seconds, and researcher Lynn pressed the eject lever and set the sealed reel into the vault with a firm, final click.